Are you sheltering in place, isolated, feeling alone? Well, then you're just like us.
Hit me.
From Studio P in Sausalito, the home of the quarantined hit, it's time for...
Succotash.
Succotash Shut In, the Soundcast stimulus package featuring snippets from comedy...
Soundcasts.
And now, here's your host for this episode, Tyson Saner.
Insaner.
Saluton, estes me, Tyson Saner. I'm your host this week, the week before last, and presumably the week after the next one. Last week, and presumably next week, your host will be Mark Hershon, who created Succotash, the Comedy Soundcast. We've been sharing hosting duties to push out miniature weekly shows for your listening pleasure in this thing we now call Succotash Shut-In. Show 207 had some fantastic content that you probably should check out at your earliest convenience. In fact, if you'd like to turn this episode off and listen to the previous show because you have not done so already, I won't be fussed one iota. Technically, I won't even know, unless you tell me. Or if you tell Mark Hershon and he relays that info to me. For those of you still listening, I have 3 clips for you from the Soundcasts 6 Seasons in a Podcast, The Bitter Sound, and Deliver Us from Disney. Of course, we have an ad from our longtime fake sponsor Henderson's Pants, and our more recent fake sponsor TrumpPoetry.com. So, let's get to it. Leading the pack, it's 6 Seasons in a Podcast, from Alex Burdine. It's a soundcast that focuses on the Dan Harmon-created television sitcom Community, and its description says, "It's been 10 years since the debut of this amazing show. I wanted to talk to the people behind the scenes to uncover who wrote what, and what it was like bringing to life our favorite comedy. We'll talk about the best jokes, the best moments, and everything we've learned from 6 years at our favorite community college, Greendale." So, this clip is from May 21st, 2020. It's from Season 1, Episode 21, Advanced Television Studies, with special guest Neil Goldman. And in the description it says, "This week I talked to Neil Goldman, executive producer and writer of Community. He took me to school on how to make great television as we revisit Scrubs, Family Guy, and yes, Step by Step. I love talking with him, and I know you're going to enjoy his inside look on making TV we love."
What ways do you think Community is like Scrubs? Because I think there's you have this cast, you have these misfits that come together. Do you have anything that jumps out to you?
Yeah, I mean, well, what you're saying, certainly, it's an ensemble show, all with very specific characters. Scrubs also had these what we called concept episodes. Mm-hmm. I don't know that we were the ones to coin that term, but certainly My Screw Up was one of them, in the sense that it was sort of a Sixth Sense concept episode.
Mm-hmm. My Way Home, I think, which you wrote.
My Way Home was Wizard of Oz, yep. Correct. That was a concept episode. We did our musical episode. We did our, like you mentioned earlier, the one that took place in front of the multi-camera, that shot on a multi-camera stage. Yep. With the concept episode. So, it had those things going for it that sort of translated to Community. The show had a lot of heart, which Community did. It had the same challenge of wanting to do sort of fun, outrageous things, but figure out a way to ground it and make it about something emotionally. Scrubs had that in common, but was very different about Scrubs at the same time was that Scrubs had this setting that lent itself to stakes, lent itself to real world stakes, just by virtue of being in a hospital. That was the very germ of the show in Bill Lawrence's mind was, oh, how crazy would it be for you to go to work on your first day of work, but you're responsible for whether someone lives or dies potentially. Mm. That's sort of the whole germ of the idea. The challenge with Community, we all realized early on, I think, and it was part of the reason why Community eventually why we became so enamored with doing these conceptual episodes, why Dan did especially, was because you're on a community college campus that the stakes aren't life or death. The stakes on a community college campus are, like, for the most part, how good a grade did you get, in this class? In a way, this community college was kind of this bubble that wasn't giving us, it was giving us story engines for, funny classes and professors and certainly dynamics. But I think Dan knew early on that we weren't going to necessarily, and he didn't want to get it. By design, it wasn't about like, oh, every episode of the show is going to be about how well we're doing in school. It just, no one would care ultimately, because the fact is they were still in school for another few years. So, one of the big arguments in that show, and one of the big themes of conflict between the studio and Dan and the network and Dan, and all of us, it wasn't just Dan, was the desire from the network and the studio, and it was a well-meaning desire. We understood where it was coming from, to make the show, quote unquote, more accessible, to make the show, quote unquote, more normal, right. Have the shows be about, but part of the argument we would say back to them was, well, again, it's like, we're always going to do shows, and this is why ultimately where the challenge came in, that were about the characters' relationships with one another, their dynamics with one another, and their dynamics as a group. Scrubs Scrubs had a little bit less of that. Community's DNA was about the study room scenes, and about the I read someone's article today who wrote about, in the wake of being on Netflix, people are being very cool and like listing off their favorite episodes. And this gentleman's favorite episode was the bottle episode that Megan wrote with the pen being stolen, which was basically an episode just about group dynamics,
just talked with her about that episode. So, right. People who are listening to this know very much so about that. We talked about it for a while.
Right. We could, and I said this to you off podcast before too. Like you could do a podcast about every episode of the show, because of the way it evolved, and they were so tricky. Because Dan set the bar very high for the show in general, but also for these episodes. Conceptually, in terms of what he wanted to do and how he wanted to push things, and how he really wanted to reinvent the wheel, and do things that people never saw before. But getting back to that original point, that wasn't necessarily what Studio Network were after. They had some fears that, or it was fear / sort of expectations of like the way TV conventionally works is that, the audience, they didn't want the audience to go, what the hell is this?
Yeah.
And the way around that was to make sure that if we were going to do these big episodes, paintball being sort of the first one, I think, that really crystallizes for us Modern Warfare, that ultimately it couldn't just be about the characters playing paintball and who's going to win. That episode, it wasn't until we figured out that it needed to be about Britta and Jeff's relationship, and play with the romantic comedy that we've been sort of, planting seeds for and arcing out through the season, that ultimately it wasn't going to feel like a sketch, the episode, because no one would care. That would get old very fast. They had to be following something that they were invested in with respect to these characters and their relationships to one another.
So in addition to Apple Podcasts and other places that you can find Soundcasts, you can find 6 seasons on a podcast at anchor.fm/SIX-SEASONS-PODCAST. That is 6-seasons-podcast. Next up, The Bitter Sound, created by none other than Davian Dent of Strange Times Podcast. Its description is short and to the point. It says, a stereophonic journey into a world of dark comedy, music, and strange audio. Yes, this is not your typical podcast, although I guess it's getting harder and harder to determine what that would be. Many people tend to think of podcasts as being conversational, or interview shows, news-type programs. But there's many soundcasts out there that are also narrative-based or audio collages, or a little bit of both. We've even featured some of them on Succotash before. I'm pretty sure The Bitter Sound has been featured before. Frank Conniff put together something called The Pundits of Oz, which we clipped some years ago. And these are more narrative-style soundcasts. So the clip is from this most recent episode, which dropped on May 13th of 2020, called The Diary of a Sad Ape. And the description says, the dark psychedelia returns with a twisted look at life through the lens of a manic mind. Yes, the previous episode of The Bitter Sound dropped on iTunes on the 23rd of June in 2016.
In just a moment, we'll talk more about the case of a British woman who's been getting tramadol in prison in Egypt. I'm keen to hear from you if you haven't quite done that yet.
A group of major retailers say the UK remains very reliant on McDonald's. Retail expert Claire Bailey has told Eddie where the cuts could come.
Eliminating a number of customers, and they're also eliminating fish.
It's 5 o'clock. Here are the news headlines. 9,000 jobs at Tesco under threat.
If those cunts fucking sack me, I'm going to shit all over their dilly.
Boy, don't get your tits out.
Tomorrow, MPs will return to the seemingly never-ending question of what to do about Brexit.
Well, I can't speak.
This is an ABC News special report. Now reporting.
President Trump just appearing in the Rose Garden, about to announce a deal to reopen the government. Let's listen.
As everyone knows, I have a very powerful drone.
You what?
We need 2,000 miles of criminals in Congress. No matter where you go, they're coming by the hundreds of thousands. At the same time, we need to increase drugs. They save good people from attempting hope. So let me be very clear. We really have no choice, and we want them to enjoy the blessings of criminal cartels, narco-terrorists, and human traffickers. The painful reality is that the tremendous economic and financial burdens of law-abiding communities fall on the shoulders of immigrants. Duct tape put around their faces, around their mouths. In many cases, they can't even breathe. They're old, they're tired. And I want to thank you all very much. Thank you very much.
You're a wanker.
Can I get a radio check?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, roger that. Good afternoon, Edwards Air Force Base Tower. This is Learjet, call sign Alpha Mike Alpha, Mike Alpha Mike Alpha. We're looking for landing clearance. We spawn in the air over the localizer approach 17 right, looking to transition into a downwind base to final for a full stop landing.
Like our paladins.
Houston, I see a UFO.
What's going on?
Am I in the right voice communication channel? Sorry, I'm just looking for landing clearance on 17 right. Can we get that?
Hold on, we got some migrants who have come from Somalia and have soiled the entire airfield with pee.
And I have no idea what the fuck we are talking about.
Roger that.
Okay, we got Roger.